everyone. My name is Sanders Kleinfeld, and it's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Jarvis to Talks at Google to discuss his new book, The Gutenberg Parenthesis, The Age of Print and Its Lessons for the Age of the Internet. If you're joining us on the live stream today, we'll be doing audience Q&A at the end of the talk, so please drop any questions you have in the chat on the right. In his book, The Gutenberg Parenthesis, Jeff Jarvis takes us on a journey through the 500-year historical period bookended, pun intended, by the introduction of the printing press in the early 15th century and the advent of the internet and the digital age at the end of the 20th century. He explores how the technological advances of the print revolution ushered in disruption in every facet of life: political, economic, educational, religious, cultural, and social. By studying the challenges and opportunities societies across the world faced as they adapted to the era of print and later mass media, Jarvis argues, we can learn much about how to navigate the transformative technological changes we face today. Jeff Jarvis is the Leonard Tao Chair in Journalism Innovation at the City University of New York's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, where he directs the Tao Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism. He was the creator and founding managing editor of Entertainment Weekly, TV critic for TV Guide and People, Sunday editor of the New York Daily News, a media columnist for The Guardian, and president and creative director of Advance.net. He blogs at buzzmachine.com and is the co-host of the podcast This Week in Google. He's the author of 5 books, including What Would Google Do? And Public Parts, How Sharing in the Digital Age Improves the Way We Work and Live. Thanks so much for joining us, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Sanders, and thank you, Google, for having me on. It's an honor to be here, and I really always enjoy conversations with Googlers. I thought I would take just a minute or two to explain what the heck the Gutenberg parenthesis is. This phrase comes from 3 academics at the University of Southern Denmark, Tom Pettit, Lars Ole Sauerberg, and Marianne Borch, who argue that the era of print is an exception, a parenthesis in history, and that as we leave the era of print, not that print's going to die, we can learn much from what came before. And so that's the idea behind the book, that I wanted to look at the entry into the age of print as we now leave it for what follows in the digital age, to see what lessons there are for the decisions that we have to make in this transition. A quick timeline here to just set some context. So before Gutenberg, printing movable type was indeed developed in Korea and China. Whether there was a link to Gutenberg, we simply don't know. Gutenberg's Bible came off the press in about 1454. For the first half a century, the incunabular or infant age of print, it looked like the scribe's work. Only after 1500 did we start to see the book take on the appearance that we now know today, with things like titles and title pages and page numbers and paragraph indentations. And by the way, the business of print around then was in shambles because there was too much investment in the old stuff. It was rescued by Martin Luther and the controversies that he would create. Go another century on to a few years this side and that of 1600, and we see an amazing rush of innovation with print in the form of the modern novel with Cervantes, the essay with Montaigne, a market for printed plays with Shakespeare, the invention of the newspaper. It's really important, I think, to see that technology went to the background and invention with the technology came to the forefront. Another century on, the year 1710 saw the business model for print created with the Statute of Anne and copyright. And then this idea of content as property became the organizing principle of media to this day. Another century on, after 1800, we saw the first development with the technology of print. It remained pretty much the same all of that time. I'm holding in my hands a single letter. And when you think that every word in every language that was set in type was set one letter at a time, it's rather awe-inspiring. But after 1800, we saw steam-powered rotary presses and linotypes and typesetting machines and cheap paper made from wood pulp instead of fabric. And this led to mass media and an entirely different scale for media. Now we go to 1920 and onward, we see the first competition for print, radio and broadcast. And here we are today. And what I left out of this, of course, is the internet. And I mark the internet as a popular institution with the introduction of the commercial browser in 1994. So that's to say that we're only about a quarter century past the beginnings of the popular internet, which would be to say that we're at the year 1480 in Gutenberg years. So one of the lessons I take from this timeline and this history that I recount is that we have time. is that we are at the beginning of what I think is fundamental and major change in society, and we have major decisions to make. So next, I look at some lessons about that, and very quickly, they are these. The first is that the Gutenberg age led us to this idea of content, that things are contained at the beginning and an end, and an alpha and an omega, and that before that, society was very conversational. And even in the early days of print was conversational as well. The Luther against the Pope with their books and the burnings of them. But come mass media, come the different scale of media, I think the public conversation was controlled, was fenced in as a commons. And now I think we return to a conversational age. And we have forgotten as a society how to hold that conversation. And I think we're trying to relearn that now. So I want to emphasize the idea of conversation over content. Next, I decry the idea of mass media and the mass. To think of people as a mass is to forget them, is to not listen to them, is to group them as an anonymous bunch. And I think that that came again after the mechanization of print. Before that mechanization phase, the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the US was 4,000. It was a good Substack newsletter. But come the mechanization and mass media, we all get grouped in together. I think what the internet does is kill the mass media business model, and with it, the idea of the mass. The next lesson is that whenever there are mechanisms for more people to speak than could speak before, that could be heard before, obviously those who held the means of speech before are going to resist. And I think we see that happening today through things like Black Twitter, where we see groups of people who've always had a voice, but who couldn't be heard because they weren't represented in mainstream mass media run by people who look like me, old white men. And now we see communities having their place and their venue online. And that causes a resistance in return, a reformation and a counter reformation. And so I celebrate the idea that we return to individuality and to community. And then there's also censorship that comes along as well, and copyright and other mechanisms of control. And these are institutions of society that we now have to look at and think about changing as we reach this new reality. Last anecdote. In 1470, 15 years after Gutenberg's Bible, Niccolo Perotti, a translator of Latin in Italy, was much offended by a shoddy translation of Pliny. And he demanded that he wrote to the Pope and demanded that he appoint a censor for the press, to an erudite and scholarly person to approve everything before it got printed. And I thought about it, and Perotti wasn't actually asking for a censor. He was instead anticipating the growth, the following invention of the institutions of editing and publishing, which would indeed assure to a great extent the quality and authority of print for a half millennium to follow. But now those institutions are inadequate to the scale of speech that we have today. And I think we need to invent new institutions. And like Perotti, we have to stop thinking of just the negative and the bad and disinformation, and instead have institutions that are going to focus on finding the good, the authoritative, the brilliant, the talented, to discover and share and nurture that in this new culture that we create together. So that's a very quick view of the Gutenberg parenthesis. And so I look forward to discussing this with you, Sanders, and with the group.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that eloquent summary of the entire history of the print era in about 5 minutes. That's amazing. So first off, I just wanted to say that I really love the metaphor of Gutenberg's parenthesis and how it really conveys the idea that we should consider that historical era as really a digression. That actually kind of surprised me. I'd never really thought about it in those terms before. And I was wondering if that surprised you as well when you were researching and writing this book.
Very much so. Tom Pettit, who's a British educator who's from the University of Southern Denmark, is the one who popularized the idea here in the US at a talk at MIT. And he's a medievalist. He is fascinated about how news and information and culture was passed around through ballads and things like that. And in looking at it, one thing that I learned as well is that we have to avoid periodization. We have to avoid diminishing the prior age. There was no dark ages, and I think that what Pettit really insists we should do is to return to lessons that we learn from that time. That does not mean that we erase print. That does not mean we forget the lessons of the print era. We can now add them as we decide what we want our era, or I'm too old, the era of children and grandchildren to make around digital culture.
Exactly. There's still so much to learn from that era, which I was just fascinated reading all the stories. One thing that really stuck out to me, and you alluded to this a couple minutes ago, was how laborious the original era of print presses was. Just how much effort went into making a book on a printing press. We tend to think of automation as making things really, really fast. And I guess it's in reality more just as long as it's a little bit faster than what came before, it clears that bar. But just reading about that was fascinating.
Speed and scale are relative, right?
Hmm.
So a scribe would take up to a year to do one book, and scholars would have to travel to the book, and students would have to be read to from the book because they were so scarce. And you think about what Gutenberg did. It's what fascinates me because I'm fascinated by technology. I'm been a fanboy of Google, having written a book called "What Would Google Do." I'm fascinated by these transitions. Gutenberg was a proto technology entrepreneur. He had to solve all kinds of technology problems around metallurgy and chemistry, also financial problems of getting risk capital to be able to make the book. And to think what goes into a piece of type, to sculpt a mold, sculpt a model, push that into a mold, turn that into a handheld mold, we believe is how he made it, pour into that molten metal that's made so that it can cool very quickly, so you can make lots and lots and lots of letters. And this was immensely faster than scribes and reach more scale. Come the end of the 1800s, my favorite machine ever made is the linotype. And just to continue the show and tell here, this is a matrix, a mold from the linotype. And a whole bunch of these put in a line allowed text to be created a line at a time, thus the linotype. And this is an example of a line and how long. And that it was the last machine needed to speed up and bring to scale media. And it really opened up that age of mass media. And by the way, the new business model, which is that you could sell content publications at a loss and make it up on advertising. Thus, we find ourselves in the attention economy.
Yeah, exactly. One related somewhat anecdote that I found interesting, I didn't know, was that the term stereotype actually has its etymological origins in printing. So somewhere in between that era of typesetting by hand and the linotype that you were referring to, like stereotypes are actually the molds, correct, that are used to print a single page over and over again.
Right. And it fascinates me, Sanders, that if you had to set a book and you sent it letter at a time, right? One letter at a time, one line at a time, bit by bit, and then you print it. And then if it sells well, you've got to do it all over again from the beginning. There was no way to save that work. So stereotyping was about placing a mold, basically made of cardboard, but other materials as well, onto the type so that you could then in turn mold page after page after page from that. And you saved this process of making the type, of typesetting, and also redistributing the type back to the case because it's so very expensive you couldn't spare it for very long. Um, Now, there's one theory from Paul Needham at Princeton University that um, Gutenberg experimented with stereotyping 2 lines at a time and tried that. And there's a lot of fascinating work that goes into trying to tear apart one of the books that he made, tear apart, studying it, not actually tearing it apart, called the Catholicon, to see whether that's how he made the book that way. But that process was apparently never tried again until the 1800s.
Yeah, what I found really interesting about that story too that you were getting at is that innovation in the print era actually was quite slow, from the introduction of the Gutenberg press to innovations like stereotyping and the linotype machine, like you were alluding to. So on the technical side of the actual physical machinery, but then also similarly for taking advantage in terms of content, the new affordances of the media. So I think you said it was about 100 years or so before people really tried innovations like the newspaper and what we know today as the novel. Um,
Right. And I think what's fascinating about that, Sanders, especially in the age that we're in now, is we're looking at the internet as a technology, purely as a technology. And what was and tech printing at the beginning was by all means purely a technology. and the technologists controlled everything. Gutenberg and his successors in Mainz, Johann Fust and Peter Schoeffer, a business that lasted 100 years after Gutenberg, they decided what to print. They printed it, they sold it, they did everything. But then we had specialization come out of that in the technology, and we had booksellers and publishers who would take the risk of deciding what to print and so on. But eventually, the technology became boring. To paraphrase Clay Shirky at NYU, it's when technology becomes boring that it becomes interesting, because then people believe that they can do things with it. So I think, and I'm not a determinist, and I don't think we're on a set path here. Quite to the contrary, we have decisions to make. But I think we are in a phase right now where we look upon the internet as a technology, and it's run by technologists, people I'm talking to right now. But what's going to be fascinating to me is when people make uses of that technology that the technologists or anyone else could not have perceived. And now, if you look at the internet, I think you see things like newspapers and magazines largely recognizable as newspapers and magazines. We in journalism have not begun to reinvent our field around the new possibilities that we have. And we're running scared these days from generative AI.
Yeah, yeah. In the book, you cite this concept called the bridge genre, where in the early stages of a new technology, you can really what you see happening is the old media is recreated on the new technology, and it takes some time to really find out what you can do with the new technology. So
Rachel
I'm
Scarborough
wondering.
King is the one who came up with that idea of the bridge technology, but of course, that's very McLuhanesque to talk
Mhm.
about the new medium makes as its content the content of the old medium.
What do you have any insight into like how long that process typically takes? When can we start to really see some native media? Are we seeing it now in the internet? Are we still stuck in that bridge genre era?
I think we're still stuck in it to a great extent, but I start to see little glimmers. And you may laugh at me for this, but I think the first one I see is TikTok. What
Mhm.
distinguishes TikTok is that it is by nature collaborative. And I don't think we've really seen a truly collaborative tool before. Yes, within offices and so on, but not to do things in public, not to be able to join in somebody else's tune and make a sea shanty or a musical or whatever it might be. And that excites me greatly. Otherwise, no, I don't think I see a tremendous amount of innovation yet. I taught a course with Douglas Rushkoff, who wrote the book "Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus." You know, I wrote "What would Google do?" He wrote "Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus," and we had fun in class together. And the course was called "Reinventing the Internet." And it was interesting, Sanders, because the students who were master's students age grew up with the internet, but didn't know the internet that I knew from the very beginning, hopeful, perhaps too optimistic days. And so it was hard for them to imagine an internet other than the one they see, which is centralized and corporately controlled, and thus hard to imagine an internet past that. And so I think that we have to kind of break people's minds out of the presumptions that we have in the present tense to imagine how to use these tools in wildly new ways.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to say TikTok, like to get back to the point you were making earlier about content evolving to be more of a conversation. You know, you can sort of see the early stages of that where, oh, you add a discussion forum below the post or the article or whatever. But thinking about like how we can really leverage that new media to do something completely, sui generis with it.
Yeah, I think I'm guilty of that. I started the newspaper sites for advanced publications, which was NJ.com and others, and the work still started with us. Here's our article. You may comment on it. And by the way, we're gone. We're in the bar. We don't care what you have to say. I started a program at my school in engagement journalism with a colleague, Carrie Brown, and its precept says that we start not with our ideas, not with the journalist and the journalism, but instead with the community. We send our students to first listen and observe communities and understand their needs and reflect their understanding back with humility, and then decide what journalism might bring the community in collaboration. And it may be something other than the story. One thing that is heretical from what I do in journalism is to question the primacy of the story. It's like questioning the idea that we are content factories. The story is an artifact of power. The storyteller gets to decide what the story is and who's in it and who is heard and who is not and how it neatly ends. So I try to challenge the students and think past the story to think of journalists At a larger scale, one thing I've really wanted to do is to try to create a new program. I've been thwarted so far in internet studies to bring humanities scholars together with technologists and policymakers and journalists to imagine a different future for where we could take these tools.
Yeah, I think the multidisciplinary aspect is really, really critical. And I think that really came across too, just reading your book, in that, yes, this is a technological story about a technological innovation, but it's also a story about, how that affected society in all these different dimensions. It was really transformative, just the ability to have mass media and to have print books at your disposal changed how people received and communicated information in all these different ways. And I think we definitely need to be doing that same thing with the internet, and that means looking at things from that multidisciplinary perspective. I'm really curious to hear more about, like, what that journey has looked like for you as a journalist, moving out of that Gutenberg parenthesis into this new world.
It's a good question. I think the changing moment for me was 9/11, 2001.
Mhm.
I was at the World Trade Center. I survived, obviously. I was a journalist and stuck around and was a block away from the South Tower when it came down. And a week later, after having made my way up to Midtown and written my news story, I had more to say. So I started blogging. And I saw bloggers in Los Angeles, as it happens, were the first ones to write about what I'd said and link to it. And I responded and realized this was a conversation that was occurring in different places in different times, that the nature of media properly conceived was conversational. So that was a life changing and career changing moment for me. And everything since then, and all the work I've done, has been trying to kind of figure that out. Part of that is decrying the idea of the mass, because I think we have to get over that. Part of that is trying to figure out different business models to support it. But mainly, it's a different attitude about respecting the voices of many people. And the cacophony that we hear today is the sound of democracy. I'm old enough to have grown up around the time of Walter Cronkite. And as you probably have heard, though you probably didn't hear him say it, at the end of every broadcast, he would say, and that's the way it is. And for many Americans, it wasn't the way it was. And similarly, for news readers in other countries, there was this singular view of a singular reality, which was always a lie. And the book is to great measure responsible for that, right? We could contain, and journalism as well. We could contain things. We believe we could explain them from beginning and end. Whereas a never-ending stream filled with a galaxy of links is probably a much more accurate representation of life than a simple linear view.
Yeah, exactly. Things may be more chaotic now, but it's arguably a much more accurate reflection of the, multifarious nature of society that we really, really need to be reflecting in the media. So, uh, I think what came across to me is also that this reactionary feelings that a lot of people have towards some of the dangers of new media is not in itself a new phenomenon. This happened at the advent of the book as well. And also, you mentioned radio and telegraph. This is not that history is repeating itself, but this is sort of a common refrain when new media is introduced and new technology.
Absolutely, and I'm working on another book for next year about the internet and about us.
Mhm.
And somewhat to my surprise, it turned into a media critique because I'm near the end of my career, and as I look at media with self-reflection, I'm ashamed of how my field sensationalizes and engages in moral panics. And today, the moral panic that media is engaged in around the internet is going to be injurious to freedom of expression for everyone because it's leading, I believe, to bad legislation and regulation and bad policy. And I think that we've got to reconsider our priorities here and try to protect the freedoms that the internet have brought to people who, once again, were not represented at the table before, but now are there.
Yeah, the in some ways the challenges are new, but they're also not new. I love this anecdote that you shared when you were discussing the print era about sort of the parallels between our current cacophonous era and the coffee house of London, and I think it was like the 1600s, where people had the same fears and concerns about fake news being spread through that venue as well. So, um,
So Habermas famously believed that the public sphere was born in the coffee houses with Tatler and Spectator as
Hmm.
publications there. I believe that publics were created much earlier. They were created with the book. They were created when Martin Luther chose to publish in German rather than in Latin, and created a public around that, and started to standardize the language of German and thus the notion of Germanness. Having said that, yes, the coffee houses are absolutely fascinating as a parallel today, because you saw, to an extent, different classes mixing, though it was only certain crusts of the cake that were in the coffee house, and they were reading publications, and the publications were in turn. One of them put a big lion's head with an open mouth in it, where people could put in tips for the next day's publication, and they would see that come around. There was a feedback loop of what the public was talking about in these places, and the coffee houses were jealous of the publications. They were pissed that they had to buy the publications, so they wanted to start their own. And it was the first, is distribution king or is content king kind of fight that we have to this day. But what was king was conversation, and the coffee houses were necessary. Now Habermas says that there was a rational critical debate, but there's a couple really good books about coffee houses that I cite where, no, they weren't exactly brawls, but they could get nasty and they could even get violent. And it feels like the internet. It's a very good, I think, metaphor for where we are today, with people who previously weren't together are brought together and aren't sure what to do together, and are trying to create a society around that.
Yeah, and the same big questions apply in both cases. How should we curate this information? What can I trust? What can I not trust? What like the anecdote that I found really interesting that you shared in the book was that in the early stages of print, people found print much less trustworthy than word of mouth because they knew the person that told them the information and they could sort of get an idea of the chain of custody of that information, whereas the print book was just sort of this mythical thing that got dropped in their lap potentially. And in present time, I think that's been inverted a little bit, where we have a tendency to trust the physical book, and worry about the provenance of information in the internet, but it's still sort of the same question inverted. So.
Absolutely is. And in a sense, it's directly parallel, because the technologist made the book, but you didn't know who it was. The provenance was not clear. It was anonymous. Who made
Mhm.
this stuff? And today on the internet, who made this tweet? Who made this stuff? How can we trust them? Well, once again, we had to create institutions to establish mechanisms of trust and provenance. And so I think that we're probably going to go through some awkward phases. Since writing the book, I've come across a fascinating concept called fama, Fama, which in Latin means it is said, but really was about every individual having to decide the veracity of what they heard based on the reputation of those they heard it from, who it was about, what history they had themselves, their own reputations, what they decided to spread it. It was a complex social system. Well, that's where we are today. We have a complex social system of trying to figure out what we read online and whether or not it might be true or it might not be, and how we know that. And the responsibility that we deputized newspapers and magazines and journalists for falls back to us in this time of speech at scale. And it's a messy system and it doesn't work very well, and people need help. But I think, again, after 2016, the election in the US, and after Brexit, there was tremendous attention to disinformation. Google staffers called me and kind of said, "What do we do?" And I raised money from Facebook and gave it away to great projects all around disinformation. But I think that we concentrated too much on disinformation, on playing whack-a-mole with bad shit. And instead, I think we have to start paying attention to good shit, and create the institutions. Can journalism change to discover and recommend authority in new ways and new voices and new lived experiences that were out of the discussion before? I don't know, but somebody has to.
Yeah, and I think what's encouraging is, like you were alluding to earlier, it's still very early days, 1480 in Gutenberg years or whatever. So it's understandable if you look at the long, arc of history, that we aren't quite there yet, and that we're still working on developing those institutions.
Yeah, I
And look,
agree, and I think that technology can be helpful, but it won't solve the problem for us. I'm sure you've all heard the story of the poor schmuck lawyer who used ChatGPT for a case and got citations and submitted to the court, and then went back and doubled down and tripled down on ChatGPT to create bad cases. And I went to the federal court hearing for his censuring, and it was fascinating because the issue wasn't the technology. The judge was not after the technology. The issue was the human. It was the human use. We've got to recognize that the internet is a human enterprise with human success and human frailties. And we've got to separate out technology's problems and those of technology companies from the human problems around them. And when media engage in a moral panic and blame the folk devil of the internet or Mark Zuckerberg for all of our problems, for racism and sexism and disinformation and destroying democracy, they're missing the underlying problems that are long with us that we brought to the internet that we have to deal with.
So I want to bring the audience into this great conversation as well. It looks like we have a few questions here from the audience. Could we bring one of those up? A question here from Arash. Have you read Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business? If so, familiar with its thesis, how do we evolve beyond print and video back to spoken word this time around?
I have indeed read it, and I admire it. It's polemical. It's frightened. It's what's fascinating is that it marks its own parenthesis and says that the age of typography was replaced by the age of television. And I would love to have seen that book updated for the age of the internet and McLuhan updated for the age of the internet because they both anticipated it. Um, but I think it's very different now because it's not about a top-down culture imposed upon us by companies. It is instead a culture that can start to define itself. And that's going to be a lot of crap and a lot of junk, but within that are voices and talents that could not have passed through the gauntlet of media before. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity there to look for the good stuff.
Do we have another question? Also from Arash, in an era of large language models summarizing long form print, will people consume original sources of content less and less? For example, just reviewing generative AI summaries?
I think that's a great question again, Arash. I'm advising, not that they're going to listen to me, newspapers and news organizations to stay the hell away from generative AI to make news stories, except in the cases that have already been proven, making financial stories and sports stories. But I do think there's a lot of potential for assisting writers and assisting the process. I had the privilege of being at Google a few weeks ago, and I got into the alpha or the beta for Notebook LM, and I'm fascinated by not only the ability for the generative AI to summarize things for us as writers and create a new user interface, but you're right. It also goes to what's the relationship that readers, the public, will have with this content. And Stephen Johnson, who's the editorial director, which is a great title to have inside Google, of Notebook LM, and I were discussing this. And as you all probably know, you can put documents in and then query them and have a dialogue with your own documents. I wonder about the public being able to do that as well as an entirely different user interface for news and content. To be able to enter into that questioning and dialogue is another interesting way to do it. So that doesn't scare me about people interacting with content in a new way. What bothers me, I think, is if we think that it can replace reporting and empathy and other human skills. And that's what I think the mistake is being made now around generative AI.
Yeah, I think, like, to your point earlier, it's a tool just like any other tool, and we have to learn how to use it to really augment what we do as humans.
I think so too. And if I may go to another question I see there from Jared,
Hmm.
we can put that one up. That the printing press led to a push for literacy. What skills do I see as necessary to best harness the proliferation of digital technologies? I think this relates to the previous question because one of the uses that I see for generative AI and large language models is that they could extend literacy. That one thing I saw in the book is that in this highly conversational society, I think it started getting locked down absolutely in mass media and mechanization. But I also wonder whether Montaigne bears some responsibility for closing down the public conversation because he set a high bar to be a writer to enter into public discourse. And many people to this day are intimidated by writing and don't like writing. And literacy now is defined not just by reading, but also by writing, creating, illustrating. And I think the generative AI could be fascinating in that it could help people tell their own stories, the stories that they control. Maybe it's code switching to generalized accepted speech, but maybe it's also just a way to help people be more creative in their own storytelling. And I think if we look at it in that expansive way and extend the idea of literacy past text and alphabet to emoji and memes, to video, to audio, to speech, and to aided literacy, I think that there's an opportunity to hear voices that were always there, but we simply didn't hear before.
Yeah, it was. I think it's interesting to think. We often think about gatekeeping in a very literal sense in terms of who gets those opportunities. But I think there's also a social component to that, which who feels comfortable taking those opportunities and enabling these new technologies to lower that barrier, so that more and more people not only have the opportunities for speech, but can really feel comfortable and have the mechanisms at their disposal to express themselves the way that they want is really critical and important as well.
Yeah, and it's troubling. I mean, I've defined myself in my life as a writer. Well, now there's a machine that can write, that can turn out decent sounding prose, perhaps better than mine. It may not be factual, it may have other issues, but the skill of writing isn't so special. And the writer, thus, isn't so special. So we have to find our value elsewhere. We have to find it, I think, in community and empathy and education and other things that we can bring to the public and to public discourse.
I think we have another question. What do you see as the responsibilities of Google and its likes in this new era?
A wonderful question, Ava, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that's what I've been working on in a next book for next year is trying to understand that. As I say, I think that media have been simplistic in their moral panic about the internet and blaming everything on Google and on Facebook, and well, we can blame a lot on Musk. Is a mistake, I think. But you're right, there are responsibilities there. And what I wish for more than anything else, I think, is for technology companies and also media companies to have North Stars, to have a covenant of mutual obligation. I was on a working group called it's a very long title, um, Transatlantic High Level Working Group on Content Moderation Online and Freedom of Expression. Breath. And we worked on policy questions around content moderation. Um, and in that, what struck me was that I think that when companies put out community standards, they are imposed upon communities. They are not of the communities, and they put no obligation on the company. I would like to see discussion about what I call covenants of mutual obligation, where we discuss generally together what we owe each other, and that we owe each other as users, as citizens, things online, to be as truthful as we can, to not foster hate, to call out people who do bad things, and so on. But the companies also have obligations to us. And I think that they have to be in a position to make judgments. And I recognize that judgments are expensive to make and are controversial to make and are political to make. But I think that together we're building the internet of the future a brick at a time. And every time any of us do anything on the internet, we're deciding what that internet is going to be. And so I think that companies can set an example by making warrants for what we can expect of them, not just to organize the world's information and make it accessible. God bless, that's a great mission. But more than that, how should we treat each other? What are we here to build together? What is it we want to accomplish together? What's the end goal of all of this? What are we working toward? What do we want to encourage? In the Gutenberg parenthesis, I wrote about trying to reimagine copyright around what I called credit right, which is to recognize that people bring value to a whole string of creativity. How might we imagine rewarding and thus encouraging different behaviors to build a better future and build a better internet? But however, I also think that one thing that could happen is that I remember years ago Eric Schmidt saying that Google would always get the worst treatment because it was the biggest thing on the internet and the internet was causing trouble, so Google was going to get trouble. And I hope in a way that you as a technology company become less front stage, less in the spotlight, that others in the humanities, in anthropology and ethics and history and community studies come forward to take their responsibility as well on the internet, and that companies like Google help them do that.
I think that's a great way to look at things. Um, so I know you're not a huge fan of the title of futurist, but in this last couple minutes, I'm going to put you on the spot anyway and ask you, like, what do you see happening in the era of digital media in the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years? Do you have any sort of prognostications that you'd like to share?
Well, so I make fun of the idea of the futurist, and some people who call themselves futurists don't like me for it. But I'm just saying that I think that prediction is a fool's errand. So
Hmm.
I'll try not to be a fool right now, and instead talk about, I think, my hopes. The entire point of the Gutenberg parenthesis, the entire point of looking at the choices that were made, good and bad, as we entered into the age of print, is that we have choices today. And so we can make good choices, we can make bad choices. We can choose to try to control speech more, to be more authoritarian, to limit innovation. That obviously is, I think, a wrong path. Instead, we can choose to build a better internet, to encourage freedom, to get to the unintended consequences quicker, to understand what to do about them, to be a little bit optimistic about mankind and humankind rather than presuming that everything everybody does is awful online, to recognize that there are more voices. In the book, I write a sizable chunk about Black Twitter, and in February, I was playing host to, with four great scholars of Black Twitter, a Black Twitter summit at my school in New York. And I think there are great lessons there about technology and how it's used. And one of the original coders from Twitter was in the room, and he said, we didn't make, looking around the room filled with people who were on Black Twitter, we didn't make Twitter for all of you. We made it for white guys who go to South by Southwest. And the point of two great books I'll cite, one is Black Software by Charlotte McIlwain, and another one is Distributed Blackness by Andre Brock Jr., is that Black Online and then Black Twitter showed tremendous technological savvy in adapting and using the affordances of technologies that were not built for them for the purposes of their communities. And so, what I think we see happening in the future is that if we leave the internet still open enough, which is a cause that Google fights, if we create tools that people can use on their own will and volition, then we'll be surprised. Then along in the future, somewhere, there's a Cervantes and a Montaigne and a Shakespeare and the guy who made the newspaper who can surprise us and not be a product of technological determinism and futurists, but instead have a vision that we couldn't have imagined. That's what I hope for.
I think that's a great way to look at it. Thank you so much for this really fascinating, enlightening conversation, Jeff. And I'll just remind the audience again that Jeff's book, The Gutenberg Parenthesis, is now available in print book form, as well as in the Google Play Store and where you get digital books as well. So I really wanted to thank you again, Jeff, for taking the time to stop by and chat with us today.
Sanders, I thank you so much, and I thank Google and Googlers for the conversation. And my life is an open blog, so you can find me and continue the discussion and challenges on Blue Sky and Mastodon, and yes, the thing formerly known as Twitter.
Thank you very much again, Jeff. It was great having you.